There are wounds on the human body that time can heal. But there are cuts carved into a nation, a continent, a generation's soul that stretch across centuries and never close on their own. They do not bleed in the physical sense. They bleed in another way, quieter, slower, deeper. These are the wounds of history, wounds made of chains, of seizure, of the stripping away of human dignity. And Africa carries those wounds on its body. When the Sahel wind sweeps across the red dust fields, you can still hear the echoes of footsteps dragged away from the land of their ancestors. When the rainy season pours onto clay rooftops, you can still sense the shadows of those who never returned. History does not live in books. It lives in the breath of the people still alive today. It lives in every inch of soil they still call by their mother tongue. And it lives in the question no one wants to face, but no one can escape. Why do these wounds remain open, even after hundreds of years have passed? Many believe slavery is only a story of the past, that wooden ships, iron shackles, and human markets disappeared long ago. But those who understand history know a truth that is far less comforting. Slavery did not vanish, it only changed shape. When the rusted chains were thrown away, chains made of laws were built. When people could no longer openly call a human being property, they replaced the word with clever terms like contract, administrative zone, protectorate. The moment the world declared slavery ended was the very moment new systems of domination were born. And that is why the wound does not close, because it has never truly stopped being cut deeper. Imagine a continent divided into halves, thirds, fifths, by cold straight lines drawn on maps with no regard for the people living there. Imagine communities that lived in harmony for centuries, suddenly forced to become enemies because of a decision made in a room in Berlin. Imagine your land, forests, rivers, and seas treated as ownerless gifts others had the right to take. And imagine this not happening for 1 year or 10, but for centuries. You will understand why the wound will not heal. But this is not just the story of centuries past. It is not a slice of history frozen in a museum. It is the key to understanding what we see today. Because from slavery to colonial rule to modern-day neo-colonialism, every version is simply a new way of removing a people's right to decide their own destiny. Today, when a country becomes poor, selling gold yet owns no gold, when a nation grows cacao but cannot decide the price of cacao, when a land rich in uranium still leaves its people without electricity, the old wounds of history ache again. We often ask why so many African nations are rising at the same time, why they speak of dignity, why they speak of freedom, why they speak of history returning. The truth does not lie in recent events. It lies in the centuries they lived, endured, rose up, and were pushed down again. History does not disappear. It waits for the right moment to return. And that moment is today. Today, when small nations declare they will no longer accept the old model, when young leaders rise and say Africa is not a global child that needs guidance, when people grow angry that their resources are taken while their future remains dark, when the drums of the Sahel echo through public squares, across fields, through radios in rural villages, when people begin asking the question, who has been deciding our fate all this time? That is when the wounds of history awaken. This beginning is not here to tell a story of suffering, but to help you understand why the story we are about to enter is more than history. It is the map of the present. It is the reason millions are rising. It is the explanation for why the awakening of nations like Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali is not a coincidence, but the alarm bell of a continent that has for too long been made to forget its own worth. If you want to know why Africa is changing, if you want to understand why names like Traoré, Ibrahim, Sankara, Lumumba are spoken again as symbols, if you want to see clearly the wound that never closed on the body of history, then continue this journey. And before stepping into the next part, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel, because this story does not just need to be told, it needs to be carried forward. And you will be the one who ensures these voices do not fall into silence once again. When people talk about slavery, the first images that come to mind are usually a pair of feet shackled in iron, a body bound on a ship's deck, or the cries echoing through the dark wooden holds of ships crossing the Atlantic. But that is only the surface. Chains were not slavery. Chains were only a tool. What was truly stolen was not the ability to walk, but the status of being human. Not the physical freedom of movement, but the right to define oneself. Slavery began with a single act, simple but brutal, turning a human being into an object. From that moment, everything changed. A child stripped of a name, a man erased from his lineage, a woman treated as property that could be bought or traded, a life no longer measured in years, but in usefulness on a sugar field or in a damp warehouse, an entire soul compressed into a number, a unit of labor. And in that moment, slavery moved far beyond the physical world. It became a system, a philosophy, a worldview built on the belief that some were born to rule and others were born to obey. Imagine a morning in West Africa hundreds of years ago. A misty coastline, waves crashing against stone, and silhouettes of people forced together at gunpoint by European traders. Cold iron rings locked around their wrists. No one knew where they were being taken. No one knew if they would live long enough to return. And in that moment, the ships that pulled away carried not only their bodies, but also the memories, languages, songs, stories, and traditions of an entire continent. These things cannot be weighed or priced, yet they are the most precious parts of any human being. When people lose the ability to tell their own story, that is the true form of slavery. The most brutal part of slavery was not the beatings or imprisonment. It was the way the oppressors tried to turn the theft into something normal. Auctions were given respectable names. Ledger books listed the number of people sold alongside entries for salt, gold, and roads. People locked in warehouses were labeled merchandise. Across generations, injustice was written as logic, taught in churches, justified by philosophy, and legalized by governments. An act of evil became a structure. And once evil becomes a structure, it becomes the foundation of an entire world. Africa felt this more deeply than any other place, not only because millions were taken away, but because millions who stayed behind had to live with the silence they left. Slavery did not only steal people, it stole the way they saw themselves. When a nation is told over and over that it is inferior, that it is suited only for physical labor, that it was born to serve, that it has no history, no thought, no civilization, those words cut deeper than any blade. Chains can be broken. But poisonous beliefs about who you are far harder to destroy. Slave traders understood this. That is why they did not only capture bodies, they captured memories, they captured languages, they captured traditions. They severed people from their own roots. They knew that a tree pulled from its soil would wither, and a nation uprooted from its identity would be easier to control. That is why slavery was not just an economic system. It was a project to reconstruct human beings according to the will of the oppressor, and that was the first wound in Africa's long journey. But what the oppressors never understood is that the human spirit always leans toward freedom. In the dark, suffocating ship holds, people whispered songs in their mother tongue. On sugarcane fields, they taught their children the names of the stars over their homeland. In long nights, when they were forbidden to sleep, they reminded each other that they had once been warriors, healers, builders, storytellers. They remembered, and that memory was something no one could take. Slavery became the root of every layer of oppression that followed. It laid the foundation for colonization. It planted the seed for modern neo-colonialism. It taught the world the toxic lesson that power could be built on the humiliation of others, and it left on Africa's body a wound that has not healed to this day. But to understand why the events of the 21st century burn so intensely, we must face one truth. Slavery never ended. It only changed form. In the next chapter, we will see how iron chains transformed into chains made of laws, of administration, of borders drawn in cold straight lines on maps, and only when we see that journey clearly can we understand why Africa today is rising with such force. If slavery was the first wound, then colonialism was the shiny golden bandage the oppressor used to cover it, pretending everything had become better. But beneath that glittering bandage, the wound kept bleeding. Colonialism did not erase domination. It simply made domination legal, refined, and harder to see. When European powers announced the end of slavery, they did not abandon their interests. They only changed their methods. Instead of iron chains, they used paper chains, laws, and soft polished words like development, protection, administration. What the world called the civilizing mission was in truth a massive economic project built on systematic extraction. Let us return to Berlin, winter of 1884. In a warm room, men from different empires sat around a long table. In front of them lay a map of Africa, nearly blank. Not one of them had been born on that continent. None spoke its languages. None understood its natural borders, its tribal ties, its religions or political systems. Yet, with a few strokes of their pens, they divided the continent into pieces. They called it rational partition. In reality, it was the grand arithmetic of greed. Those cold straight lines turned communities that had lived in harmony into strangers, and strangers into reluctant neighbors. Two cousins could be placed in two different countries because of the shaky hand of a diplomat. One ethnic group could be split into 3, 4, even 5, simply for the convenience of the mapmakers. From that night onward, an entire continent was restructured according to the will of men who had never understood it. And then they declared themselves the bearers of civilization to Africa. Colonialism functioned through a simple principle: create an administrative system that looked legitimate, then use that system to take everything of value. Empires built courts, schools, churches, administrative offices, but each of these structures existed for one purpose: control. A small number of Africans were recruited into the governing machinery, but they were only cogs in a machine designed by outsiders. The laws were written by foreigners for the benefit of foreigners and imposed on the local people. There is a truth many history books often avoid. Colonialism was not the replacement for slavery, it was the upgraded version. If slavery required transporting millions to plantations across the ocean, colonialism discovered a more efficient method. There was no need to move laborers far away. All they had to do was seize the land, build a government, and force the local population to work right where they lived. The land belonged to Africans, but everything harvested was shipped to Europe. People became cheap labor on the very soil of their ancestors. What made colonialism even more dangerous than slavery was its ability to hide behind beautiful language. It spoke of development, but development for the invader. It spoke of education, but education designed to produce obedience. It spoke of modernization, but only modernization of roads that served resource extraction. The golden masks of civilization were worn only to hide the old face beneath: exploitation. But colonialism did something even more dangerous. It did not only control land or economics, it controlled imagination. It planted into the minds of the oppressed a toxic belief that they should be grateful to their oppressor, that without colonial rule Africa would remain in darkness, that they could not build their future without foreign guidance. Once a people believe that, oppression has cut deeper than any blade, but at that very moment, seeds of resistance began to grow. Even in regions under the tightest control, people stood up, from Zulu warriors to Ashanti leaders, from Kenyan farmers to the highland communities of Ethiopia. They did not only resist the man holding the gun, they resisted the entire system, trying to redefine who they were. Because beneath the golden mask of colonialism, they saw the truth the world tried to hide. Africa did not need to be civilized. Africa only needed to be returned to itself. Colonialism was the second chapter in a centuries-long cycle of domination, but it was also the place where the first flames of liberation were lit. And to understand why that resistance erupted so fiercely, we must step into the next chapter, where the drums of freedom began to echo across lands that had endured far too long. No system of domination can last forever if beneath it burns the fire of people who refuse to kneel. The history of Africa, from slavery to colonial rule, is not only the story of oppression, it is also the story of those who rose in the darkness, not because they believed victory was guaranteed, but because they knew silence meant accepting their erasure from history. And it was they, not international treaties or Western conferences, who kept the word freedom alive on this continent. In the damp evening air of the Mau forest, the whispers of Mau Mau fighters carried through the mist. They had no modern weapons, no backing from any global power. They had only machetes, sticks, and an invisible belief that humans are not born to live under someone else's boot. Before battle, they would place their hands on the earth to feel the heartbeat of their homeland. They believed the land listened. And that was how they reminded one another that this resistance was not for themselves alone, but for those yet to be born from that very soil. Thousands of miles to the south in Zulu territory, mighty regiments gathered under the banner of pride. Zulu warriors struck fear into European empires because they fought not only with weapons, but with an unbreakable spirit. They refused to let the land of their ancestors fall into the hands of invaders because of a treaty they had never signed. In battles like Izanulwana, they proved that Africa was not a continent that bowed its head. It was a place where courage could shake even the strongest armies in the world. But not only great kingdoms resisted. In West Africa, the Ashanti fought British invasion with both blood and heirlooms passed down for generations. In East Africa, the Nandi battled relentlessly for a quarter of a century. In Namibia, the Herero rose up against such brutality that they came close to annihilation. Each rebellion was crushed with violence, but each defeat left behind a spark. A people might fall, but their will would drift across lands and generations like embers blown across the desert. What mattered was not the outcome of each battle, but the meaning behind them. Every flame of resistance told the world that the borders drawn in Berlin had no right to decide Africa's destiny. Every fallen fighter declared that domination is never natural. It must be forced, imposed with guns, prisons, and torture. And that truth haunted the empires. They knew they were not welcome. They knew every village held a quiet voice of defiance. Every forest sheltered someone ready to fight. Every field carried a story they could never erase. Even in places without battlefields, resistance lived on. It lived in the beating of drums outlawed by colonizers, but played secretly during ceremonies. It lived in old stories dismissed as superstition, but whispered by mothers to their children. It lived in festivals, songs, and dances that colonial rule tried but failed to destroy. As long as culture lived, the spirit of resistance lived with it. This was what the mapmakers in Berlin never understood. They could seize land, but not the human heart. They could write laws, but not force people to believe those laws were just. They could raise flags in city centers, but not raise them in the souls of the people. And that is why uprisings kept returning, one after another, even though each faced brutal repression. African resistance was never a series of isolated events. It was a continuous current, sometimes glowing like embers, sometimes erupting like a roaring flame. This current passed from generation to generation, from Ashanti warriors to the Mau Mau movement, from Zulu uprisings to the independence movements of the mid-20th century. All of it formed one long chain of longing for freedom. And then, in the latter half of the 20th century, these flames met, merged, and rose into a wave unlike anything the world had ever seen. A continent once divided into dozens of pieces began to rise and reclaim its voice. To understand why that wave erupted with such force, we must step into the next chapter, where the years after World War II became the lightning strike that lit up a continent that had endured for far too long. There are moments in history when everything seems frozen for centuries, then suddenly begins to move all at once. After World War II, the world entered a new era, and that moment became the fierce wind that ignited the remaining embers of centuries of African resistance. The tribal drums, the warriors' oaths, the uprisings that had been crushed did not disappear. They only waited for the right time to rise together into a great flame. And from 1945 to 1975, this continent erupted like a storm of liberation. The post-war world had changed. The European empires that once felt powerful enough to divide an entire continent with a few lines on a map were now exhausted. Their cities were bombed, their economies collapsed, their military strength drained. Meanwhile, the ideals of freedom and human rights repeated at international conferences began to turn into pressure against the very powers that had once denied them. The colonized nations realized that the calls for justice Western nations preached to the world were the very tools that could expose their hypocrisy. In 1945, at San Francisco, the United Nations was founded. Its charter spoke of the right of all peoples to self-determination. Those words traveled across the globe like a bell ringing. But nowhere did that bell echo louder than in Africa. It was not a promise, it was an invitation. For the first time, the colonized could anchor their struggle to a global principle that confirmed what should have been theirs all along. Only 3 years later, in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was born. To Africa, it was not just a document. It was proof that colonialism was not only unjust, but illegal in the new world being built. Young Africans, students studying in Europe, intellectuals returning from universities in America, France, Britain, began asking a simple but dangerous question. If all peoples have the right to freedom, why don't we? But if international documents were the wind, then the local leaders were the fire. In 1945, at Manchester, a Pan-African Congress brought together names that would later become legends: Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, W.E.B. Du Bois. They did not simply discuss the future. They laid the foundation for the generation of liberation. They understood that if Africa did not rise together, the continent would remain divided, each nation isolated and dealt with separately. So they decided to build a movement for the entire continent. Then something happened that history had never witnessed before. In 1956, Sudan became the first African nation to gain independence after the war. A year later, Ghana stepped into history under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah. When Nkrumah stood on the podium and declared that Ghana's independence meant nothing if the rest of Africa remained in chains, he did not speak only to Ghanaians, he spoke to the whole continent. The years that followed unfolded like an earthquake. In jest, 1960 became known as the Year of Africa. 17 nations became independent in just 12 months. New flags rose. New capitals sang their anthems for the first time. Traditional festivals, once banned under colonial rule, returned. It was not simply the collapse of a political system, it was the rebirth of dignity. But victories were never complete. As the liberation movement spread, new shadows appeared. Patrice Lumumba, who led Congo out of Belgium's brutal control, was assassinated only months after independence. Sylvanus Olympio in Togo met the same fate. Modibo Keïta in Mali was overthrown. Young nations were attacked from both outside and within. The imperial powers, though weakened, did not abandon their ambitions. They looked for ways back in through more subtle strategies, no longer under the name colonialism, but under phrases like regional stability, security assistance, or development cooperation. And yet, even as leaders fell, the liberation movement did not stop. Algeria fought for 8 years to win freedom from France. Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau battled until 1975 to break from Portuguese rule. In southern Africa, South Africa, and Namibia still lived under apartheid, but the spirit of resistance had already filled every corner and laid the groundwork for future revolutions. The wave of 1945-1975 did not only redraw Africa's political map, it reshaped how Africans saw themselves. Once told they could not govern a nation, they proved they could build a future. Once taught they had no history, they began writing their own. But like every great turning point, Liberation was not an ending, it was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where the old rulers returned with a new face, friendlier, more civilized, but just as dangerous. To understand that chapter, we must move to what came next, where colonialism transformed into its most subtle form, neo-colonialism. The history of 20th century Africa is often told through images of flags rising on Independence Day, through bold speeches echoing in the air, through young leaders smiling under camera lights. But there is another chapter, darker, harsher, and rarely spoken aloud. It is the chapter of those who fought for freedom, who reclaimed sovereignty for their nations, but who died alone, died in the shadows, died at the hands of those they once believed were allies. It is the chapter that has been forgotten. Yet without it, the story of Africa's liberation is incomplete. When countries won independence between 1945 and 1975, the people celebrated, but the powers that had lived off those nations' resources did not step back quietly. They had lost control of the gold mines, the diamond fields, the oil wells, the cacao farms, the coffee plantations, the fertile land. They had lost political authority. They had lost influence networks built through a century. And they understood that to keep what remained, they did not need to return with armies. They simply needed to remove the leaders who were determined to build a truly independent Africa. Patrice Emery Lumumba was among the first to pay the price. In 1960, he freed Congo from Belgium's brutal rule, but that was only the beginning. He wanted more than a flag and an anthem. He wanted Congo to become a strong nation, untouched by foreign corporations. He wanted the country's resources to serve its people. That alone made him a threat to those who had long viewed Congo as an endless treasure vault. Few know that only 9 months after independence, Lumumba was overthrown, captured, tortured, and executed in secret. His body was completely destroyed, leaving no remains, no grave, no trace. They wanted to erase him from history. But the people of Congo did not forget, and neither did Africa. Lumumba was not alone. In Togo, Sylvanus Olympio attempted to free his country from financial dependence on France. He sought to create a national currency, breaking the old chains. Only weeks after that decision, he was assassinated at his own doorstep. Explanations were offered, excuses crafted. But history knows there is no coincidence in deaths like these. In Mali, Modibo Keita, who pursued strong economic independence, was overthrown and imprisoned until he died. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, the father of African liberation, was removed from power during a trip abroad. His house was destroyed, his books were burned, his statue taken down. They were not trying to erase a man, they were trying to erase an idea. In Algeria, Ahmed Ben Bella was removed from office. In Guinea, Sékou Touré faced countless attempts at overthrow and sabotage. In Burundi, Prince Louis Rwagasore, the symbol of national unity, was assassinated shortly after winning the election. The deaths continued, forming a long hidden list that has never been fully revealed. What did these leaders all have in common? They sought true independence. Not independence on paper, not a new flag, but real control over their political and economic destiny. They understood that freedom was not simply the return of land. Freedom was the return of the power to decide one's future. And because they understood that, they became targets. These assassinations were not only meant to remove individuals, they were meant to inject fear into young nations. They carried a cold message. If you challenge the system built over hundreds of years, you will disappear. If you talk about economic sovereignty, you will be isolated. If you look the former master in the eye and say that era is over, you will be replaced immediately. But they were wrong. The liberators fell, but their ideas did not die. Lumumba has no grave, but his name is a torch. Olympio is gone, but his story echoes in every movement demanding financial justice in West Africa. Nkrumah was toppled, but his vision of a unified Africa became the intellectual foundation for future generations. More importantly, their deaths taught the people one profound truth. Independence was only the first step. The oppressor might disappear from the political stage, but their influence remained in the banks, in mining contracts, in puppet governments, in currencies controlled from abroad. That was the shadow clearing the path for a new form of domination, subtler, less bloody, but far more dangerous. To understand that system, we must move to Chapter 6, where colonialism returns, wearing a new outfit, softer, friendlier. But beneath the fabric hides sharp claws of power and interests that never intended to let go. When new flags were raised, when capitals shone bright during independence celebrations, when the people believed a new era had begun, that was precisely the moment another enemy quietly walked in. No guns, no uniforms, no conquest of land, no forts, no military posts like in past centuries. This enemy arrived with smiles, with documents, with promises of cooperation and development. It was neo-colonialism, the most sophisticated form of domination. If slavery was the chain of iron, and colonialism was the chain of laws, then neo-colonialism is the chain made of invisible forces: currency, debt, information, diplomacy, trade. A system where a nation may have an independent government, but not independent policies, where resources lie within their borders, but profits flow elsewhere, where the flag flies over native soil, but the power to decide the future sits in offices thousands of miles away. This is domination no longer enforced through violence, but through structure. In the years after independence swept across Africa, Western powers quickly realized they no longer needed direct rule. They only needed influence. They did not need to occupy capitals. They only needed to control central banks. They did not need to oversee every field. They only needed to control global commodity prices. They did not need to station troops on African soil. They only needed to impose conditions on loans, binding young nations to obligations they could never escape. This is why Kwame Nkrumah, the man who lit Africa's liberation, called neo-colonialism the most dangerous stage of imperialism, because it is hard to see, and an enemy you cannot see is the hardest to fight. Look at the monetary systems many West African nations are forced to use. Their currency is printed in another country, their foreign reserves are held by a foreign bank, they produce gold, cacao, oil, yet the profits are decided by those who have never set foot on their land. This is not the people's fault. It is a system designed with intention, one that ensures dependence even after the flag has changed. Or consider the contracts for resource extraction. On the surface, they appear to be partnerships. Beneath the surface, they are slow bleeding. A gold mine may lie on African land, but most of the profit is taken by foreign corporations. A uranium field may power all of Europe, yet the people who live beside it do not have electricity to light their homes. A country may sit on vast oil reserves, but its citizens pay higher fuel prices than nations with no oil at all. This is neo-colonialism in its purest form, making the victim believe the problem is their own incompetence. And when a nation dares to break free of that system, it immediately becomes the target of smear campaigns, economic sanctions, and even covert support for internal forces seeking to weaken or overthrow its government. History has seen this pattern repeatedly, from Lumumba's Congo to Olympio's Togo, from Nkrumah's Ghana to Angola, Mozambique, and even the nations of the Sahel today. The lesson remains the same. Political freedom without economic freedom is an illusion. But what makes neocolonialism most dangerous is the illusion that oppression no longer exists. Nations have seats at the United Nations. They have territory, constitutions, flags. But none of these answer the most important question. Do they have the right to decide their own destiny? And when the answer is no, then the flag becomes nothing more than a beautiful symbol hiding an uncomfortable truth. Yet, as in every cycle of African history, awakening never dies. A new generation sees clearly that they cannot continue living in a system where their resources enrich others. A new generation asks why countries rich in minerals have citizens living in poverty. A new generation realizes the enemy no longer holds a rifle but carries contracts, no longer takes people but takes their future. And from this realization, a wave of awakening begins to rise. From the Sahel to West Africa, from youth in the cities to families in rural villages, people are beginning to ask the right questions. And when a people begin asking the right questions, history begins to shift. This is the moment we enter the next chapter. A chapter where Africa no longer speaks only of past suffering, but of present awakening. A chapter where a new generation decides they want more than independence. They want a future. There are moments in history when a continent that seemed to be asleep for centuries suddenly opens its eyes. Not because someone called for it, not because the outside world changed, but because the people living on that land finally understood something profound. They had spent too many years believing promises from elsewhere, and it was time to write their own story. That is exactly what is happening across Africa in the 21st century. For decades, the world viewed Africa through a narrow lens of poverty, conflict, and instability. But they did not see the quiet tremors beneath the surface. They did not hear the questions forming in the minds of the young. They did not notice the frustration that had been building for generations, and they certainly did not see the growing tension between endless natural wealth and the poverty of its people. When silence lasts long enough, it eventually becomes a scream. In the 21st century, three powerful forces have made this awakening unstoppable. The first force is awareness. Young Africans are more educated, more connected, and more informed than any generation before them. They no longer accept the stories, the powers of the past once imposed on them. They are looking at the wealth of their own countries with new eyes. They ask why a nation with vast reserves of gold and diamonds still has citizens living in mud homes. They ask why a region exporting uranium to light up Europe has children studying by oil lamps. They ask why cacao from West Africa fuels the global chocolate industry while the farmers who grow it remain the poorest link in the chain. These questions are not complaints, they are alarms. And once people begin asking the right questions, they cannot return to silence. The second force comes from the neo-colonial system itself. For decades, African nations operated within models they did not choose. They used currencies controlled from abroad. They signed extraction contracts that worked against them. They borrowed money under conditions that locked them into dependency. They lived within a structure where poverty was not the result of failure, but the result of design. But the difference in the 21st century is that this model has become exposed. The contradictions can no longer be hidden. People see wealth flowing beyond their borders faster than they ever saw it exist. When an unjust system becomes visible, it begins to collapse from within. The third force is the rise of young leaders willing to break the old patterns. Leaders like Thomas Sankara had planted the seeds long before, but those seeds were buried under violence and sabotage. The 21st century has witnessed the return of that spirit. From Burkina Faso to Niger, from Mali to other regions, a new generation of leaders is standing up and saying what previous generations were afraid to say, that Africa does not need saviors, that African resources belong to African people. That dependency is not destiny, but a choice, and choices can be changed. These leaders did not appear out of nowhere. They emerged from the exhaustion of the people, from the disappointment with outdated systems, and from a rising hope for transformation. When tens of thousands gather in the streets to support them, it is not coincidence. It is the sign of a new era. But Africa's awakening is not happening only in speeches or public squares. It is happening in major economic decisions that shape the future. When a nation refuses to let outsiders determine the value of its resources, that is awakening. When they demand transparency in extraction contracts, that is awakening. When they choose equal partnerships instead of dependency, that is awakening. When they declare that resources must no longer be exported raw but processed within their borders, that is awakening. And when they say they will no longer accept a currency controlled from outside, that is the clearest declaration that the old era has ended. Africa's awakening in the 21st century is not a spontaneous movement. It is the result of centuries of suffering, resistance, and learning. It is the result of a past that proved imposed models cannot bring prosperity. It is the result of a present where young people are informed enough to see the structures holding them down. And it is the result of a future they refuse to let slip away. Because if they do not rise today, their children will inherit the same wounds. This is why Africa is rising so powerfully in the 21st century. Not because the world allowed it, not because global powers relented, but because Africa was silenced for far too long. And the longer a continent is forced into silence, the louder its voice becomes when it finally stands. In the next chapter, we will go to the place where this fire converges, where Africa does not only speak of awakening, but speaks of a second liberation, where past and present meet to create a future that cannot be reversed. There are moments in history when people stand before a new threshold, not because they want to cross it, but because behind them lies an old world so decayed it can no longer hold them. And Africa, after centuries of slavery, hundreds of years of colonial rule, and decades of neo-colonial control, is standing at that very threshold. A continent once forced to live within someone else's framework is now opening the door to its own future. That is why this moment is being called the second liberation. The first liberation freed African nations from direct rule. The second liberation frees them from dependence. If the first liberation was the fight to hold the flag, the second is the fight to hold destiny. And the truth is, the second battle is always harder, because the enemy of the second liberation no longer wears uniforms, it carries contracts. It no longer fires bullets, it controls financial institutions, it no longer builds military camps. It builds networks of influence woven into entire economies. In this landscape, the 21st century has brought something unprecedented, a generation of African leaders who not only ask questions, but dare to answer them. They do not speak only of political freedom, they speak of economic freedom. Not only of national pride, they speak of ownership of resources. Not only of independence, they speak of self-determination. They understand that flags, anthems, and parliaments cannot create the future if the most vital elements of a nation remain in someone else's hands. This is why the fire is spreading. Because for the first time in a long time, the words of African leaders are not just promises, they are declarations. Declarations that the era of asking permission, the era of seeking approval from outside powers has ended. Declarations that Africa's wealth must serve African people first. Declarations that unfair contracts must be rejected. Declarations that any system that keeps a nation poor must be broken apart. These declarations rise from Burkina Faso, from Niger, from Mali, from the very nations once dismissed by the world as fragile and weak. Yet it is these nations that have become the starting point of a new wave. Because when a place is pushed to the edge, it sees the truth more clearly. When you have nothing left to lose, you have no reason to bow. What makes the second liberation different is that it does not happen only in politics or in the streets. It happens in every layer of life. In the economy, where nations insist on processing their resources locally instead of exporting them raw. In finance, where they reconsider monetary systems controlled from abroad. In diplomacy, where they form new relationships based on equality rather than dependency. In society, where people begin to understand that poverty is not fate, but the outcome of a structure that must be changed. Above all, the second liberation is a liberation of the mind. A people cannot build a future if they believe they do not deserve one. And for decades, neo-colonialism pushed many nations into believing they were powerless, that they could not stand alone, that without the guiding hand of global powers, they would fall apart. But the awakening of the 21st century has shattered that illusion. People now see clearly that the imposed systems Were the chains slowing their steps? When a nation realizes this, its power transforms. That is why the second liberation cannot be stopped, because it does not come from one person, but from a collective, not from one political party, but from an entire generation, not from outside pressure, but from an inner voice. It spreads through emotion, through disappointment, through belief, through hope that has been suppressed for far too long. The second liberation has begun. You can see it in the eyes of young people standing in the squares of Ouagadougou, in the powerful speeches rising from Bamako, in the crowds raising the flag of Niger as a declaration that fear no longer rules them. It is unfolding right now, minute by minute, day by day. And the most important truth is this: this liberation will not stop, not because it is perfectly organized, but because it is born from generations of pain, not because it is backed by material strength, but because it is backed by truth. And once truth is seen, it cannot be covered again. In the next chapter, we will cross the threshold into the conclusion, where history is no longer the tragedy of the past, but the foundation for a future the world must now acknowledge. We will reach the place where this entire journey converges into one message. The future of Africa is no longer written by others. Africa will write it for itself. When a long journey reaches its final stretch, some stories end with the sound of victory trumpets, with history closing its pages, with the feeling that everything has fallen into place. But Africa's story is not a closed book. It is a manuscript being written every day. Every line, every page is shaped by the choices of millions, by the changes unfolding quietly in distant villages and awakening cities, by the bold decisions of hearts that refuse to be guided by anyone else. Looking back across more than 2 centuries, we can only describe it as a passage through darkness, from slavery to colonialism, from colonialism to neo-colonialism, a passage where each generation inherited the wounds of the one before it. But what kept Africa from ever collapsing entirely was the fire that never went out in the hearts of its people. And today, that fire burns brighter than ever. Africa is in a rare moment, not a moment of chaos as some outsiders want to believe, but a moment of transformation. A moment when long-avoided questions are finally being asked clearly. Why is the richest continent in the world the poorest? Why do nations with gold, diamonds, and uranium still beg for aid? Why must people living on fertile land import food? These questions are no longer ignored. They have become the center of a new conversation about the future. And when the questions change, the answers can never stay the same. Today's generation does not seek salvation from outside. They do not wait for promises from international institutions. They do not place their destiny in the hands of those who once drew borders, without asking the people who lived inside them. This new generation has decided not only to rise, but to rise in a way that leaves no path back. The second liberation, as we have called it, is not just a movement against a system. It is a movement to reclaim human worth, to reclaim the right to dream, to reclaim the right to choose the future. And above all, to declare that history is no longer a mirror of pain, but a mirror that finally reveals strength. But we must not deceive ourselves. The road ahead will not be smooth. The forces that dominated Africa for centuries will not surrender their advantages easily. Old systems remain rooted in economics, law, and mindset. Structures that once pushed Africa into cycles of poverty still exist, and change cannot come overnight. But the truth is this: Africa has crossed the point of no return. The voices that have risen cannot be forced back into silence. The flags that have been lifted cannot be pulled down easily. And the young who have seen the light of the future cannot be pushed back into the dark. The story is still being written. It is not the story of one nation. It is not the story of Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, or any single country. It is the shared story of a continent rising after centuries of being forced to kneel. It is the story of people who understand that if they do not write their own future, someone else will write it for them. And now, the question is no longer whether Africa will rise. The question is where each of us will stand when it does. You are hearing these words for a reason. A story is just words if we do nothing with it. But it becomes action when you help carry it forward. Because awakening never comes from one person. It comes from a collective moving in the same direction. So if you believe what is happening in Africa needs to be seen by more people, leave a comment and share your thoughts. If you want to keep traveling with this journey, subscribe to the channel. If you want to be part of the wave that brings this truth to more ears and more hearts, share this video. Your words, your click, your presence can be the piece that helps write the next chapter. A chapter the continent is writing with dignity, with will, and with the belief that the future is not given, it is claimed. Africa is rewriting its history, and you can write a part of it too, starting from this very moment.